I'm super excited to have today with me Karen Doyle Buckwalter, who is first off a dear, dear friend. And I it's so hard for me to sign it sort of in capsule describing who Karen is because she's so many things to me personally, but Karen is the best way I can describe it is she's a national leader in the world of treatment for attachment and complex trauma. She is a speaker nationally on the subject. I've had the honor of seeing her speak nationally several times. She is brilliant about the neurology and behavior of children with complex trauma-related needs. I have learned something new and amazing every single time I've seen her speak. She is now an author with a couple of books out, one of which is the groundbreaking Raising the Challenging Child, which I recommend for all the parents that I work with. And she has a wonderful podcast out there called Attachment Theory in Action, which also lots of the parents I work with already listen to, and I encourage them to continue to do so. It's amazing. Karen is, again, one of my mentors. I'm so happy to be having this important conversation today. What we are going to be talking about today is really special to me because it's kind of the core of what I talk about all the time, which is really the sort of process of transforming as a parent. I know for me, when my kids first came to me, I really thought I was ready. I really thought I was prepared for parenting children who had been through some things. And I found out pretty quickly that I was not prepared at all. And we really struggled, and our family nearly fell apart before we learned some really important things and made some paradigm shifts. And then after making those paradigm shifts, we struggled some more to actually implement the things that we were learning. And so we're going to be talking today about transforming your parenting to meet the needs of children with specialized needs because of what they experienced early in life. So Karen, I'm so glad to have you. And if you want to talk a little bit about your career, that would be a really great start.
Okay, great. Well, I'm thrilled to be here with you, Tiff, and I feel like I've learned so much from you as well. And, I'm always especially excited when I'm able to interact with or do a training with or write an article with a foster adoptive parent, someone who's been in the trenches parenting the kids that many of us work with, because I feel like that really role models the importance of the therapist-parent partnership, that, we know this work can't be, okay, parent, you drop the child off for therapy and I'll go take the child back to the therapy room and do some secret confidential thing that you can't know about. That it can't work like that. We have to be in partnership. And, of course, there are occasions, especially with older kids, where we do have to honor the privacy around some issues. But in general, our practice is working hand in hand in a partnership with parents and children. I always like to say in the work that I do, my client is the relationship. It's not the child, it's not the parent. My client is the relationship. And so I think that's really important. In terms of my background, I have been at Shattuck now for over 25 years. And I'll tell you, I came there and I was trained in non-directive play therapy, a model developed by the Gurneys. Play therapists out there who would be familiar with that. I don't know if parents would be, but anyway, it was called non-directive play therapy. And I came to Shattuck and I got a job in treatment foster care. And I was trying to do non-directive play therapy with the kids that I'm immediately assigned all of these kids that are in treatment foster care, which was really kind of, we don't want to use residential so much, so we'll put all these kids in foster homes and see if we can maintain them there instead. so um so I was not having success at all with non-directed play therapy with those kids. The sessions were completely out of control. The kids were like running out of the room. The kids were, if I had sand, they were dumping the sand everywhere. I had what we call in play therapy protection aggression toys, and they would take like the aggressive toys and come at my neck with a rubber knife. I mean, it was all of this stuff that I was like, what is going on here? Like, I don't know what the theme here is. It's the theme is this isn't working. That was the theme. Okay. And so then that's when I started reading a lot about attachment, about trauma. And fortunately, I was in Illinois, so I stumbled upon the TheraPlay Institute. And that was my first exposure to a very different way of looking at these children. And they said in my first TheraPlay training, the parents are your co-therapist. So they immediately really elevated the role of parents from where I had been communicating a little bit with the parents before and after the session, and our foster parents had to write logs about what was happening. That happened in varying degrees. You can imagine, when you're caring for these kids, telling you to write a log about it, might work some days and not other days.
Right.
So that was sort of my opening to this whole other world and another way of doing work. So that's where it all started.
And I think that is such a beautiful, like, that is one of the things that makes your work so special as a parent. There are, my experience as a parent has been with my kids, and it was not what I expected. I didn't expect when our kids came to us I expected that therapy would be, we would take our kids to therapy, they would go to therapy, they would get therapy, and then we would go home and we wouldn't be super involved in that process. But we quickly learned through our kids and how things worked with our kids that we needed to be very, very involved. And so I'm so grateful for your work and the way that therapists like you work. That partnership with parents, now I know, is absolutely essential, because for my kids, there was no way that therapy could be effective if we weren't working in partnership. And I think that's such a great point that you make.
Yeah, and I think, the reality is when there are significant attachment wounds and complex trauma, that children are going to heal within the context of the parent-child relationship. And so really, I think there are some therapies that can work in that more traditional way. You go see a therapist for 50 minutes and, that you have individual therapy. And however, in this kind of work where there's been particularly relational trauma, it really the kids need to find healing in the context of the parent-child relationship and other relationships too. But prioritizing the parent-child relationship, 50 minutes a week is really, I don't want to diminish what many of us do as therapists, but frankly, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the 24/7 care of these children that parents are providing. So, if you have one approach in therapy and a different approach, all the rest of the hours of the week, and there's not the ability to work hand in hand with each other, the therapy is not going to progress.
Right. And that's what's such a great, and that's one of the things that always struck me when I saw you speak early on, before we became friends and before we started doing some special things together, which I thought was which I'm so glad that we've gotten to do some great things together. that it struck me that you had this deep appreciation for parents, and not only for the parent-child relationship, but what parents were experiencing in trying to connect with their children and trying to bring their children to healing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, whenever you're trying to learn something new, I think that sometimes you can go to extreme, like the pendulum, you know, can go too far. And just sharing a little bit of my journey, what happened. I was well trained also as a family systems therapist, and looking at the entire family system, the whole idea of one person's behavior changes, everybody's behavior has to change because the family is interdependent. And so I had a lot of training in family systems. So as I began to be exposed, now this was a long time ago. This is when there was not a lot of information out there. This was like the early, like mid 1990s, when there wasn't as much information. And so when I was starting to read about this group of children who were often in the foster care system and having multiple placements, or maybe adopted out of orphanage care, I started reading that, you know, these children have reactive attachment disorder, and that you can't look at the children in a traditional family systems way, because the difficulties that they are having did not develop in the current family system they're living in. So, you know, they're bringing this whole set of problems that developed elsewhere into the family system. And so you need to not look at this through a family systems lens. And there were even things that were saying, like, if the therapist tries to have you evaluate your behavior as a parent, then they don't understand RAD, or, you know, they are maybe aligning with the child and not understanding. So I feel like I really, for a number of years, kind of threw away that, well, not threw it away, but put it more in the back of my mind, because I didn't want to be that therapist that doesn't understand, you know, what parents are going through, that these children are presenting in a unique way that did not develop in the family system. But later, what I came to realize is, just because the difficulties didn't develop in the current family system doesn't mean there aren't certain things in the current family system that are perpetuating or even exacerbating the difficulties. So that's a very different thing, right?
Yes. I learned something even today. Already. We haven't even been talking long. Yes, that's such a great point. That's such a great point.
Yes. Well, parents can feel blamed when someone says that. So I think that, you know, it's really important how you go about. I think that you have to have enough of a relationship with a parent to begin to dialogue about some of that in a very compassionate way, because many parents have been blamed for their children's difficulties and are very, you know, by people that really are not aware of some of the unique challenges of children who've had a lot of trauma, what they present. So I think there's that, you know, having that working partnership. But I also think what I found with parents, in terms of your comment about changing, there seemed to be, as time went on, so I'm like, okay, so I need some different techniques to work with the children directly. Okay, I need some different ways of thinking about this. Okay, now I need to like involve caregivers and parents more. I will add to that also, many people who identify as child or play therapists have very little experience working with adults. And even though you're working with them around parenting, it is kind of therapy for the grown-up too. So there's like a whole learning curve for people who've never really dealt with adults in therapy, other than an update about something with the child. So then it's like, okay, incorporating parents and figuring that out and how to work with them. And I pretty quickly kind of found that there seemed to be these three groups of parents. There were parents that were like, oh my gosh, yes, this makes so much sense. Oh my gosh, I can see why some of these things would work and other things would not. And they would start implementing these things very quickly and be able to be kind of consistent with some of it, and it makes sense and they're on board. And I kind of call those people the people that you give them some information and they're off to the races, and it's not that everything goes fine after that or anything, but with some real guidance and some real coaching, they're really able to start making that paradigm shift, trying to implement some of these things. And so that was like one group. Okay. That's the group like therapists really like. Right? You come, I make suggestions, you do them, and we all feel great. The kids getting good. Okay. So we like all of them, okay? Okay, so then there's this middle group of people who they say all of those same things. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I found you. Oh, this makes so much sense. I'm reading this book, I'm listening to this podcast, da 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 da. But they're unable to actually change their behaviors towards the child. And they're like so committed and they're so sincere and yet, and they even might think they're implementing what you suggest. But because I work a lot with video and work a lot in homes, I will often see like parents that think they're doing something, but when I see it, I'm like, I don't think that's what I meant. Okay. Then there's this other group of people where it's hard to get either one. Like there's a real challenge to get them to buy into these ideas. They may feel like it's being too soft on the kids. It's letting the kids get away with things or whatever. They just don't. You have to work really hard for them to even do this philosophical shift, let alone implement it. Like they're just kind of not buying in from the get-go. Yeah. And the common denominator, though, with all of these people was they really are like great people, great parents, really wanting to do it the right way. They're giving resources, financial resources, giving their time, trying to read things. And so I really started to become, I would say, obsessed with what is going on here. Like all of these people, they are committed to these kids. They want to do well with them. They want to help them, but they're showing up, they're reading stuff, but why are some, really able to implement a lot of this and others, it's just like they can give it endorsement verbally to you, but when it comes to really being able to do it differently with their child, they can't. And then that third group, if you don't want to hear anything I have to say, why are you here? Like, what's going on here?
You're right.
Okay. So in my quest to really understand this, I mean, I of course there's a variety of factors, but I feel like one of the main factors, and the one that I landed on, and the one I think a lot of the research points to, is how you will parent. The greatest predictor of how you will parent is how you yourself were parented. And so I think now that can manifest in a lot of different ways. Like someone could say, I'm nothing like my parents and I would never want to be anything like them. So that doesn't manifest with them being just like their parents, but it manifests with them trying so hard not to be like them that they're really not responding to what's directly in front of them that the child needs. So So somehow the parent's own history is like playing in the background. You know, Selma Freiberg's famous comment about how ghosts from our own history invade the nursery. Like as soon as the baby's born, there are these ghosts from our own relationship that are invading the nursery and really almost controlling unconsciously. Parents aren't aware of this, but unconsciously controlling what the parent does. And so that's where I came to believe that these parents are genuine and they do want to do this, but in the heat of the moment, something happens. Yes, they get stressed and they go into back brain and all of that, but there's often more to it than that because everyone's triggers are different. What makes you go into back brain is related often to your own history. And so Tiff, you know, working with so many parents, sometimes I would ask a parent, what like really bothers you about this kid? Like, because I kind of want to know what the parents' buttons are, you know, what causes them to become really reactive. And you know, this is a kid that's like hitting people and smearing poop on the wall and blowing out of school. And so I'm all ready to hear one of these things. And the parents will say they're table manners.
Right.
And I'm like, you know, I'm thinking in the grand scheme of things.
Right.
But then, so first of all, the first lesson of that is it's good to ask.
Yes.
We have bias about what upsets the parent that we just assume. Okay. But the second thing was, you know, so sometimes then I deconstruct that and there's something about the parent's own history where manners were such a high value and you were basically like a very bad child, you know, if you didn't have good table manners, or their parents valued that so highly, or they were even shamed or scolded about table. I mean, it could be a number of things, but the overall point I'm trying to get to here is I think we need to begin to be able to talk with parents in a deep way about triggers and really identify in a deep way what those are. Otherwise, we start kind of giving these great suggestions that seem to work with lots of kids, and the parents mysteriously can't do any of it.
Right. And I think that I think that is such a great point, because as you were talking about it, I was thinking, you know, I tell the story all the time, and I've said it, you know, as we've been recording these, I've talked about my daughter dragging her hands along the wall, and that behavior I was for certain she was intentionally trying to drive me out of my mind. Like that behavior I was ready to die on the hill of that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea why, because it was such a small thing, you know? And it was a trigger for me. It actually was a trigger for me. Thinking back, because in my house growing up, my stepdad was really particular about that. Actually, he was, you know, and so we didn't do that, you know. So anyway, it's so interesting how, and I think that it's true that the thing about triggers, and I think the other thing is having conversations about triggers.
Yes.
And then what, for me as a parent, learning what to do once I was triggered.
Right. Yeah. And I think just when you can speak, and what we might call that is making the unconscious conscious. So when you have these unconscious things going on, they just like, it's like somebody has the keys to your car and is just driving it. Where at least if you're kind of aware of what that relates to, and I mean, it's really trauma in a way, because trauma is not being stuck in the past, it's not being able to be in the present. And then, so for you, you know, in that example, it was hard to separate, you know, those feelings from the past with this is a different thing and this is a different kid. And really, in the grand scheme of things, this is probably right?
Yeah.
And so, some people say insight is underrated, but I think around these issues, that's not true. I think the more you understand your own history, and Dan Siegel talks about this a lot in the book Parenting from the Inside Out. The more you understand your own history, the more regulated you can stay with your own kids, just to begin with. And I know you're saying we want to talk about, what happens if you become dysregulated. But, and I think I do want to point out one thing that I think, because children who've been harmed in relationships reject relationships. And I think that many parents, have a history of rejection by a parent, by a peer group, by whoever. Like who doesn't have some history of rejection? So that when these children are rejecting of you over and over, day in, and it triggers like every rejection you've ever had. Right. So I do think, that's another example of how recognizing this makes me feel like all the stuff my dad did to me. Right. So that's a whole other load of stuff that this kid's really not doing, but this kid's getting the reaction and the feelings from all of that. Exactly. And so starting to begin to deconstruct, where is some of that coming from? Like a lot of this is, it's triggered by the child, but it's really not coming from the child. Right.
And I think too, isn't part of it, is part of it when with parenting kids with a trauma history, we tend to, like, our current culture says, when children behave in a way that's uncomfortable to us, we meet that behavior. Our response is supposed to be, as parents, our response is supposed to be, make the child as uncomfortable as that behavior is making us.
Yes.
Right? And yes. In doing that with our kids who have attachment and trauma history, or trauma-related attachment, yes. Trauma-related needs, for our kids, they aren't hearing and receiving, oh, my behavior is uncomfortable. They're hearing, or you're rejecting my behavior, you're rejecting me, is what they hear.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Which is actually the same thing the parent may be hearing.
Right. And that's the point that you're making, which I think is so absolutely true. Now that I do work more with parents, and I understand my own reaction and responses with my kids. I mean, now my daughter's an adult, and I can tell you sometimes as an adult, when as a young adult, when she when we have behavior that, well, honesty has always been a behavior that we've had, that we've struggled with. And now as a young adult, when that behavior comes up, it's still hard. And I still feel myself going, the narrative that sometimes pops up for me is, when have I ever communicated to you that I would not support you no matter what the truth was? Right? That's the thing that comes up in my head. Mm-hmm. And I have to really watch myself and reframe that for myself and say, when she does that, it's not about me, it's about her. Right.
And Tiff, even though I'm such a proponent of attachment theory and the intergenerational transmission of these things, parenting is not everything. And whether you have kids who've had trauma, your biological kids, there's also this myth out there that if you do it right, whether it's biological or adopted kids, they'll turn out okay and do well. And that's not true.
Right.
I mean, just look around you. There are children that come from really difficult, awful circumstances that are, off to Harvard or something, seriously.
Right.
And then there are children that had lots of love, lots of consistency, lots of advantages, lots of privilege that aren't doing well at all. So I think this narrative out there also that if you do it right, your children will do well and they'll behave. And every time based on what I've seen with the parents that I work with, and even in my own peer group of people with biological kids, every time I hear comments like, well, it really depends on the parents, or their parents raised them right, or, well, in our house, it wasn't an option not to go to college. And I'm thinking, well, your kids might have, inside I'm thinking, your kids may have complied to that, but I can tell you, there are kids you couldn't have made to go to college, no matter what your parenting strategy.
That's right. That's right.
So I do think there's also this whole, even getting out of the particular realm we're talking about, this idea, if you do it right, then your kids will do really well. And I'm not saying there's never a correlation. I'm not, but I do feel like that is overemphasized and heaps guilt. Every child and then as a young adult has choices to make, what they're going to adapt that were their parents' values and what their parents taught them and what not. Don't you think that's missing too much?
Absolutely. I think it's so great that you're saying that. I'm so glad you're saying that because, in fact, my friend Jackie and I have been having this conversation recently. And what we've been talking about is how really parenting success really means parenting with integrity and parenting with compassion and parenting with the best skill you have. It's like, that's what great parenting is. And the outcome is the outcome with your.
The outcome is the outcome. A plus B does not always equal C in this case.
Right. Right. Because kids are people.
They are. They're people. They're different. They have choices. They may reject a lot of what your values were, even if you went about teaching them in a very kind, compassionate, understanding, excellent way. So I know it's going to sound really trite and weary, and self-care, as well as understanding.
Oh, you froze. Are you there now?
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you froze, and I bet I froze too.
Yes, you did. I'm sorry.
So I think you wanted to talk about, though, so when parents are in that moment of really overwhelmed and I'm not going to deal with this in the therapeutic parenting way, what can they do and how can we help them? And I think that it takes a tremendous amount of support.
Yes.
I don't think there's any other way. And I know that sounds maybe overly simplistic, but even in looking at the data from the Illinois Adoption Preservation Program, which really did some nice research around this, one of the number one thing that parents found helpful, unfortunately for me as a therapist, was not finding a great therapist for the child. It was interacting with other foster and adoptive parents. That was the number one thing that helped parents feel supported and able to continue moving forward with parenting their children.
Yeah. And I think I can say for myself, having other people who were willing to learn how to support your kids in a way that they could step in and take care of your kids. That's for me. That for me has always been my biggest thing, as you know, what I call relational mentors, people who can come in and take
I think that is so critical. I think, and to me, that falls under the umbrella of support because, folks out there, parenting, no matter who they're parenting. I mean, they may have grandparents that can help out, or they have activities that the children go to. I mean, look at all the parents right now who are having their kids 24/7 that are really struggling because they're used to their kid being able to go to a summer camp, or they're used, their kid, is normally in school all day. And when all of those natural supports are taken away, and you have a child that would that when like they're taken away for these parents, not because of COVID-19, but you have a child that blows out of those kind of programs. Right. So I think we talked before about the level of isolation of families and feeling like it's all on me really mirrors what a lot of parents who have kids with, really challenging behaviors, where they can't just go to the summer camp, or, they're not doing well in school, or they're not at youth group or scouting or something for a few hours so you can do a date night or something. Like, if your child can't do any of those things, then that's a loss of support. And that's where I think your relational mentor is key.
Exactly. And I think too, that's one of the things that that I'm seeing with the parents that I support and work with, is that in the beginning, well, and you were talking about parents in the three categories. The parents that I work with during this time of COVID-19, the parents that are really in that first category that you were describing, they were actually really enjoying being at home with their kids for a long time in the beginning, because they were actually able to be at home, their kids were at home, and so they were implementing all of this stuff, and things are going really smoothly, for a long time. But then the intensity and frequency of that really got to them. They needed a break and they couldn't get one.
Right.
So then it becomes exhausting, and the need for support kicks in, right?
Yes.
And then the families in the other categories were really struggling because they didn't have that support, so that they could have the stamina to try to implement and make those shifts, right?
Yes. And I think, just to bring in for a second time, like a broader sociological perspective, as we were talking about this myth out there, no matter who you parent, if you do it right, then they turn out great. And if they don't, there's something wrong with you. Bruce Perry does talk about this. Mary Pfeiffer and others talk about, that ideally we had a large extended family or tribe around us helping with parenting. So, that in and of itself, again, looking just from a social perspective, that it's, again, harder to parent any child now, because we're not as connected as neighbors and family and aunts and cousins and uncles, and we're geographically spread out, so already some of those supports have been taken away in terms of how children were raised years ago, when they were almost like raised by the church, the school, the neighborhood, the synagogue, whatever. Like everybody was kind of on board, like.
Absolutely.
And so then you look at now, a lot of those supports being gone, and then what little is left, these parents can't access what little is left because their children's behaviors are too misunderstood, too out of control, whatever. So it's really a recipe for disaster without that. That's why I love your relational mentor idea. And we're finding at Chaddock that, again, it doesn't bode well for me as a therapist, but I will tell you that our director of foster and adoption has said there are many cases where if I had to pick a parent coach or a therapist, I would pick a parent coach. Now, just in terms of defining that for us, our parent coaches are people who've worked in residential and have managed a lot of really severe behaviors and
Right.
have taught other people how to do that. So our therapist, that's a different skill set than our therapists have.
Right.
We're
Right.
used to seeing like one kid and maybe a kid and their parents for 50 minutes. Like we're not used to 24/7 when they're peeing on the floor and throwing the toothpaste at you. Like that's not our everyday occurrence.
Yeah.
So not that we can't help and give ideas about that, but I do think people who've been there and done that have a different skill set than therapists. And again, I'm a therapist myself, so I'm not trying to diminish what we have to offer, but I do think the mentors, parent coaches who have experience, whether it's in our case residential staff who have been with these kids, hundreds of them over many years, whether it's parents who've raised these kids, I think we really have to honor what they bring and not just always think, oh, if we could just find the right therapist in our community.
And I love one of the things that you have said too before is that there are lots of ways to intervene.
Yes.
It's not just therapy.
Right.
Because a lot of times we think that kids who have this level of need, the only way they can be served, the only way they can be supported is in the therapist's office. And that's really just not true. It's
also not realistic.
It's not. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's not. I think that that's really true. Our kids need a lot more support than that.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, parents, I think it's sort of that idea that you talked about earlier, that the idea is you find a good therapist and you take the kid there and like you pick them up. And I mean, I do think that's still the prevailing idea out there. And we might throw a psychiatrist in there for some medication. And I think that they're really missing out. That's why I said, I was so excited about your work with Relational Mentors, because there are a lot of places across the country where there's not a therapist trained in some of these ways, or there's a shortage of child and adolescent psychiatrists. And I'm not diminishing the help that any of those people can give, but if you're in a more rural area or you're in an area where those services aren't available, the parent coaching and relational mentors and these very creative ideas are it just expands the number of people that can provide help and support out of the paradigm of like the medical model.
And that's what's so great about, I wish we had a Chaddock in our area. Chaddock is so great because Chaddock is available to your community, right? You have a community school and all. So that's really a great thing that you're available to your community as well. And that's not available everywhere.
This maybe goes without saying, but we were having a conversation yesterday about a situation, and part of the reason that we can succeed is because of how many people we have. Like, we have teachers, we're in the school environment with teachers with this training. We're in the home environment, in the cottage environment with staff who have this training. And somebody then, when you are really, going into back brain, or you're going to blow it, or you're like, the heck with this therapeutic parenting, somebody else can take over. So part of it is not, we are trained in a lot of clinical models, and that does make us unique. And I don't want to undersell all the work we put into that. But part of it's manpower. Like, we have enough people that when somebody's, the shift can change, or somebody can step in and take over. And so some of it is not just what we're doing. It is what we're doing, but we have enough people to consistently do it all the time in a way that's not possible in a home. when there's like you and one
Exactly.
other adult and possibly other children.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that we've talked about many times, but I just want to touch on is, um, obviously nobody thinks that being in residential is the optimal situation. It's a last resort situation when a child's need is so great that they can't be at the present time in their family situation. But what is wonderful about that as a resource for kids with extremely challenging with extreme challenges is the ability for them to get the intense level of care
Yes.
that they need at the time.
Yes. So that's why, I mean, for people who think residential should just vanish and it's not right for everybody, I really don't agree with that. I mean, we did, start our intensive in-home program where we go fly to people's homes and intensely work with them multiple days with a therapist and a parent coach to try to prevent out-of-home placement. So we obviously believe it should be a last resort. But I do think it is the right thing for a certain number of kids. And, once the kids start cycling in and out of the local psychiatric unit and all of these kinds of things, and are put on these huge medication cocktails, and I mean, it's like that is really typically not providing a lot of success for our kids.
Absolutely. And as a parent, I can say that I'm so grateful for places like Chaddock that are specialized in attachment and trauma, that really do the work of getting to those deep attachment and trauma related needs so that kids can go, because the whole goal is for them to be able to go back to their home and be able to be
right
successful in their
and I
family.
think Winnicott talked about it, and others, that holding environment and needing to create a holding environment. And sometimes when you do start working on these issues, the holding environment that the kids need is just more than what a family can provide. The
Absolutely.
levels of aggression and different things, that even if you're doing this in a very sensitive way, aware of sensory issues, aware of co-regulation, it just takes a while sometimes for the kids to work through the tremendous pain and anger, and it comes out in behaviors. It does.
Absolutely. I want to hold up your book. And I also just want to say, I wish I had time to go through this entire book and ask questions and talk about, but there is one, my very favorite thing in this book that I think every parent should get, is there's a whole section of the book that is, that says it's okay to revisit an earlier stage. That's my very favorite part of the book. Can
Yes.
you just speak just a tiny bit to that? Because
Yes.
it's my favorite part of the book. I'm so glad somebody said it.
Yes. So I think that, some parents, we do talk about, that we have to look at the child at their developmental age and not their chronological age. And I think, that's another thing that's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But I think that this part that you're bringing up is, and so, like, there may be moments when they need, even though they're in the body of a 13, 14, 15-year-old, they need something that a 2 or 3-year-old needs. And, or they need that level of attention for certain periods of time. So I think it's a really way of operationalizing this idea that, if they are at that younger developmental age, particularly in certain moments, then what do you do? I mean, I think one of the most common things people will tell me is they'll have a child that's older and you know, 8, 9, 10, and they run away. And I'll say, so what would you do if they were 2 or 3? Well, I'd hold their hand. And I say, well, hold their hand, you know? I mean, and what is often interesting too is parents think, well, they're not going to let me do that. And they do.
Yes, they do.
They do. Now, if you go about it like all unsure and thinking they're not going to let you, and this is kind of strange, and I shouldn't have to do this with a kid this age, then they won't.
Right. Or angry.
Yes. Or if you're like, give me your hand.
Right. Right.
We want to be proactive about it. And it can be anything from, you know, rubbing your child's back at night after their bath. I mean, we've had teenage boys at Shattuck who love having a bedtime story. They never had bedtime stories ever. And people are like, what? This kid whose feet are extending over the edge of the bed, you want me to tuck him in and read him a bedtime story?
Right.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
And once a staff member or a caregiver can see how the kids just kind of soak it up like a sponge, when you make it okay for them to reveal those earlier unmet needs and you're there to meet them, they will show them. They will show you those needs when they feel safe and that you're going to show up for those level of needs. Otherwise, it just can often come out in really negative, aggressive behavior, when really what's under it is these earlier unmet needs.
So Karen, I think that what happens a lot of times with the parents I work with is they get really stuck on developmentally appropriate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, can you just explain what it does for the brain and what it does emotionally when we do let them go back
Mm-hmm.
to an earlier stage?
Yeah. And so, you know, the way I like to explain this to parents is, you know, thinking of how a house is built on a foundation, and we have to have, you know, the bricks and the basement. We have to have all of this in place. All of these, you know, pieces of the foundation need to be put in place so that you can put, you know, the bedrooms and the upstairs and the roof. And if you try to put the upstairs and the roof on when there's pieces of the foundation missing, the whole thing crumbles, right? And I can tell you, we have had the opportunity, because we have an independent living program, and there are many kids that we raise through adulthood. Like, we're who they're going to have. They're aging out of the system. And, you know, we'll have people focus on, they need to learn to use the bus. They need to, you know, learn to do these independent things. They need to, you know, get a job. They need to learn how to do a resume. Here, to that I say, well, when we sent him to the job interview that we spent so much time, you know, schooling him how to do and role plays and all of that, something got him really upset and dysregulated along the way, and he never got there. So if we can't teach our kids enough, you know, regulation and how to handle my emotions, and that starts at these really early unmet needs. Like, if there are holes in the bottom of the foundation of that house, there are going to be holes in the ability to regulate yourself. And so then, you know, yeah, we can teach them these rooftop things like a resume and a job interview and all of that. But if the first day on the job, they get so upset and say F you to the person because they're so sad and so hurt and so triggered by something the person said because of these earlier unmet needs, not feeling safe, not feeling secure, not having the ability to have somebody say something like that to you and still feel like you're a worthy and okay person, none of that's going to matter. So looking at these earlier needs, you're loved, you're precious, you're accepted, all of these things, you're worthy of nurture, you matter. All of the things in that early foundational piece that we provide through children get those needs met in ways that we take care of young children. Right. Experiences they have with us that at a deep level, they know their preciousness and their value. And so that when something like that happens at the job interview, they don't feel like I'm a piece of garbage and just lose it.
Right. So it's not too late to go back.
No, it's not too late to go back. And sometimes I feel like what we're doing, we're not trying to baby them. We're trying to fortify them in a way that they can act independent consistently.
That's so true. So beautifully put.
They can act independent inconsistently, but we all know in real life that becomes problematic.
Yeah.
So I look at this as a way to fortify them in their ability to hold that level of independence and a developmentally appropriate behavior more consistently. Because that's the key. Like getting them to do that one day, like whoop. I mean,
exactly.
And I think people get overly focused on that. And so we have to look at what are their earlier unmet needs so that they can more consistently be at their developmental level. We put that brick in the bottom of the house so that when something shaky happens at the higher level of the house isn't going to collapse now. We've met some of those earlier unmet needs, and now the house can handle that.
Right. Thank you so much for drawing that out. I love that. Thank you so much, Karen. You have given me so much time. I could talk to you all day long, as we have before.
Yes. We don't like time limits on our conversation.
No, I'm definitely gonna have to. We need to do like a whole series someday. Have to have a visit or something.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate you being on, and we will make sure that everybody knows where to buy your book and how to listen to your podcast. And thank you so much for your work and for giving us your time.
Absolutely.
And
my pleasure.
Thank you. And we'll see you soon, I hope.
All right. Bye-bye for now.
Okay. Bye.